My name is Jo Vitale, that's Vitale, and I work for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. I'm one of their itinerant speakers and the Dean of Studies at the Zacharias Institute. So I stepped into apologetics completely by accident, probably with great reticence as well, actually. I wanted to be a missionary since I was 5 years old, and I just always had this passion to be an evangelist. That's what I knew I was called to. And growing up in secular England, I was the only Christian, in my year in high school. It's just life, surrounded by people who don't know Jesus. So you sort of feel that weight of, Lord, who else will tell them if I don't? So send me and I will go. But then when I spent a year in Uganda testing out the missionary thing, because I thought it meant living in a hut somewhere in Africa. And it can do sometimes, but during that year, I really sensed the Lord saying, Jo, actually, the people here, they may be physically poor, but many of them are spiritually rich in a way they're not in your own context at home. And I was so disappointed because I wanted to stay there. But I knew the Lord was calling me to do evangelism to my own culture and to the skeptics, the people who are apathetic, who don't care what you have to say. And so came back home, started doing quite a bit of trying to tell people about Jesus at university. But of course, as you're talking about it, particularly in a culture like England, which is so post-Christian, everyone has so many questions, so many objections and challenges. And so I just realized, actually, if I want to be an evangelist, apologetics is the resource and the tool that I need to remove those hindrances out the way, just to clear the view so that people can see the cross and see Jesus. Yes, that's true. And certainly continental Europe, it's harder than it is in England. What I love about England is there are still a lot of strong churches. And actually not so much in the countryside, but in the cities. And the one thing that's actually wonderful about being a Christian in England is because you're in such a minority, it means that when you ask somebody and they tell you that they're a Christian, it probably actually means something because it's cost them a lot to live under that label. So there's a good chance it's actually a very authentic faith that they're proclaiming. So in a way, I find it easier being an evangelist in that kind of context and culture because the lines are very clear as to where people stand. You immediately know where to begin the conversation and how to move forward. So I actually find it much harder being over here in the United States, especially living in Atlanta in a sort of Christian culture, because everyone goes to church on Sunday, they say they're Christian. So kind of trying to wade through that to figure out what do you mean by that. In a way, it's harder. So there are challenges to being a Christian in England, absolutely. You're definitely going against the culture in every regard, but I think it helps Christians to have woken up to the Great Commission, and there is that feeling of we have to be on mission, we have to be united as a church. We don't have time to squabble so much about denominational or more in-house Christian things, because you're so surrounded by people who don't know Jesus that you feel the urgency of the gospel call. So it's challenging, but it's also motivating in terms of sharing your faith.
So do you...
Yeah, it's very small numbers. And the statistics are amazing. Really interesting things like 75% of people in England don't even believe Jesus historically existed, which is incredible because, regardless of whether you're a believer or not, the historical evidence for that is so clear. So it's just part of the culture. My sister just married someone who had never really been to church before until he met my sister. And, I think the first time he was in a church was to hear my dad preach one Sunday because they were visiting my parents' home, and his question for my sister after the service, he turned to her and with genuine curiosity just asked, what did your dad mean when he said that God was in Jesus Christ? I think over here we just assume whatever else, whether you're a believer or not, you know what the central claims of Christianity. But in England, amazingly, given its history and the strength of even things like the Church of England for so long, actually what people don't know consistently surprises me. But I think given where culture's going at the moment, actually, because I'm primarily doing evangelism, I do some training, but it's more an evangelistic focus. What that means is actually where culture is, the most useful arguments I find, and therefore my favorite at the moment, because my favorite changes depending on what works. And so at the moment, my favorite tends to be something more existential. So it might be something around meaning, for example. You'll hear all the time on university campuses today, everyone's buying into the idea, well, I just make my own meaning, and it's an incredibly attractive idea, but I just find there's zero ground to be able to say that. In part because if you're a naturalist and you think, hey, I am just a kind of flesh machine, I'm hardwired for DNA propagation, then in that sense, there is no meaning to you. You're a product of randomness. So in yourself, you have no meaning, but also how can you generate meaning? If actually whatever else you may think you have the free choice to do, you have no free choice because you are hardwired in such a way. Or think about the ways you try to make meaning, the things that people put value in, like making meaningful choices, which you cannot do if you're hardwired in that way, or like relationships and the choice to love, but love is meaningless if we're just driven by that survival instinct to procreate. What is love? I mean, that really has no ground in that framework. Or even things like, I find meaning in purpose and the things that I achieve, but really, what are you achieving if you're just a dying mammal in a dying universe that's just getting colder and darker? It's hard to see the meaning in any of it. Whereas if we're made by God, we're made with meaning. It's intrinsic, it's built into us, but also we're made with a purpose to live with. And so all of those things that everybody cares about, like love, freedom, justice, I actually find they're only grounded within the Christian framework. And that's, things like that, like how do you get from naturalism to consciousness is an unexplained issue. And I mean, really, it just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I find that I like talking about those things on university campuses because that's what students are wrestling with, and they really want to make a difference in the world. One thing I love about the culture today is that students are so passionate about things like justice. Everyone, we slam the culture, but actually I think that's a great thing that people aren't as apathetic today, because it's something you can tap into. I mean, you can ask them, if you don't believe in right and wrong, why are you so committed to putting to right the world's wrongs? And immediately you're in a fascinating argument about what makes your life meaningful, and they will say, I want to make the world better. You say, why? Where does that come from? Because I think that comes from God. That desire, it may be misplaced in the way that it's expressed at times, or the causes that people get behind, but that longing for justice and to love someone, that is from God. And so that is something that you can really tap into. Right. Well, I would just say, I understand what you're saying, but wishful thinking works both ways, doesn't it? People say belief in God is, I think it was Stephen Hawking who said that faith is a fairy tale for those who are afraid of the dark. And it was John Lennox who just hilariously replied, well, atheism is a fairy tale for those afraid of the light. It goes both ways. We all have those innate desires that we struggle with. It's not about what you wish, it's what is true. And of course, that's where apologetics comes in, doesn't it? Because, you may have your biases, I may have mine, but we can get together and look at the evidence and say, what is actually true? What is true in history? What is true in philosophy? What is true in our experience of the world around us and the things that we value? And how can you ground those things? How can you ground human value? How can you ground morality? How do you ground justice and love and freedom? And I honestly cannot see a better worldview that makes sense of these things than Christianity. So for me, it's about saying it's not wishful thinking. It's saying what best fits the facts that we have to work with. And when I look at it all, and what I love about the Christian faith is that there are so many different arguments you can point to, one or the other, but the comprehensive picture that creates and the cumulative case, I think, is so strong. You're not going to find one knockdown argument, well, that definitely mathematically proves the existence of God, but taken together, I think it is an overwhelming case. If I'm sensing from them actually they really don't want to believe in God, then the question I go to is, tell me about this God you don't believe in. Because what is it that they have misunderstood about the character of God that makes him think he's someone they wouldn't want to know, or that somehow Christianity will be bad news for them, or that it's going to ruin their life in some way? I also think absolutely it's a heart issue. We can always push it back to some ridiculous level of, how do I even know I'm not a brain in a jar? How do I know I'm even here? At which point you're like, I cannot argue you out of this if you want to dig in there. But the way you live doesn't line up with what you're saying. You don't live as if you're a brain in a jar. You live as if your choices and your beliefs matter. Just like you don't live as if, truth is relative, except when it comes to choosing what you want to believe about life. You don't live that when you get on an airplane. You're trusting the truth that the engineers worked it out such that the plane can fly. You don't want engineers who are saying, hey, it's, well, my truth says it will fly. You want to know, is it going to fly? So, one question I love to ask people in evangelistic conversations, if I sense like we've you've got into that circle of ridiculously where you're just not going anywhere, I just like to ask people a question. Actually, Vince was the one who taught it to me, because he asks people all the time. You just kind of pause and say, can I just, let's put that on hold for a second, but let me ask you, if Christianity was true, would you want it to be? And if God was real, would you want to know him? Because it just completely changes the conversation. Often there's an awkward silence for about 30 seconds, but then the most unbelievable things come out. And then it helps people to see, hey, I'm not being honest. I'm not being intellectually honest. I'm saying it's about the issues, but it isn't. It's actually, I don't want this to be real. And then you're really in the conversation you want to be in, which is about why. What is it in you that doesn't want to believe in God? And that's when you really got somewhere. So, big focus of RZAM is we're not just about the head, we're about the heart. That's what you're aiming for always, because ultimately that's the level at which, God is going to be at work, and that's where this really needs to take place. You want to get intellectual obstacles out of the way, but you're aiming always for the heart. Whatever context you're in, whether you're primarily in Christian community or you're living in a very secular space, either way, apologetics is an everyday tool. It's not for the specialists. It's not for people who just love to have a good argument or like to do intellectual gymnastics. It's about wanting to be able to make Christ known and dealing with the real world issues that are around us all the time. And if you're not dealing with them now, you will be soon. Your children will be, your parents will be. I mean, all of us at some point, you yourself are going to hit something in your life that will cause you to doubt, or it will be a struggle about the character of God. And it's so much better to go in prepared than have everything thrown up in the air because you've just never taken the time to really dig into these things. And I think what a beautiful way to love God. The Bible asks us to love God with our mind as much as with every other part of ourselves. And I think what better way to love someone than to ask deep questions about them? The more invested you are in a relationship with someone, the deeper the questions will be and the harder they will be, because actually you'll say, I'm not going to shy away from the things other people might find difficult about getting to know you. I want to know you for who you are, even the things that are hard to make sense of, because I know that the more I understand about you, the more I'm going to love you for who you really are. And I think that brings delight to God. So if for no other reason, do apologetics, because it's a way of worshiping God.